Salt air filled my lungs as I straightened the collar of my plain grey cardigan, staring at my reflection in the tinted window of my father's truck. Today I told myself I was nobody special, just a proud older sister standing in the California sun for her brother's big day. Then my father's laugh cracked across the parking lot, sharp enough to draw eyes from 3 rows of cars away. "Elena still hasn't found real work, has she?" he said to a stranger holding a cooler, not even lowering his voice. "Filing papers somewhere in D.C. Meanwhile, Tyler's about to become a legend." My stomach folded in on itself. Words like that had landed on me 1,000 times before, and they still hit like the first time. I gripped the strap of my duffel bag until my knuckles went white, forcing my breathing to slow the way I'd trained sailors to do under fire. He had no idea that the daughter he was mocking for a parking lot audience held the rank of Vice Admiral in the United States Navy, 3 stars heavier than anything he'd ever imagined for me. Coronado shimmered ahead of us, all white stucco and palm trees, and the low mechanical thunder of helicopters practicing overhead. Somewhere inside that base, my brother Tyler was pulling on his dress whites for the first time as a graduated Navy SEAL. And somewhere inside me, a woman he'd never met was getting ready to step back into the shadows for one more day. I thought about turning around right there in the parking lot. I thought about 100 quieter Sundays I could have spent instead of this one. But my mother had asked me to come, and some loyalties outlast every insult stacked on top of them. Frank Cross climbed out of the driver's seat like a man 20 years younger than his 70, tugging his old army cap low over his eyes. He'd worn that cap to every family event since I could remember, a relic from a 2-year stint he never let anyone forget. "Grab the cooler, Elena," he said without turning around. "Might as well make yourself useful since you're here." I grabbed the cooler. The backyard reception before the ceremony smelled like charcoal and cut grass, the kind of scent that used to mean summer used to mean home. Now it just meant an audience. Neighbors and old service buddies clustered in lawn chairs around my father's grill, beer bottles sweating in their hands, waiting for the guest of honor to arrive. Nobody waited for me. Nobody ever had. "There's my war hero," my father boomed the moment Tyler stepped onto the back porch in his crisp whites, trident gleaming on his chest like it had been polished by angels. He crossed the yard in 3 strides and wrapped my brother in a bear hug that nearly knocked the younger man off balance. Watching them, I felt something twist behind my ribs. Not jealousy exactly, but the particular ache of being a stranger in a place that should have felt like home. "This is a man," my father announced to the yard, one arm still slung around Tyler's shoulders. Not like some people who ran off to hide behind a desk the second things got hard. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the lawn chairs. I busied myself refilling a bowl of chips that didn't need refilling. Mrs. Delgado, our elderly neighbor from 3 houses down, wandered over with a soft smile that had nothing cruel in it. "Eleanor, honey, remind me what it is you do again? Something with the government?" "She pushes paper." My father cut in before I could answer, loud enough for the whole yard to catch it. "Coffee runs and copy machines, Rita. Don't get her started or she'll cry about it like she did when she quit the academy." I hadn't quit anything. I had transferred from surface warfare into intelligence at 23, a decision that had opened doors he never bothered to learn existed. But explaining that to a backyard full of strangers wasn't a battle worth fighting today. Bourbon clinked against ice as my father poured himself another glass, still riding the high of his own performance. He liked an audience almost as much as he liked being right, and today he had both. I excused myself and slipped into the kitchen, where the quiet felt like stepping into deep water after too long holding my breath on the surface. My mother stood at the sink drying a glass she'd already dried twice. "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds," she said softly, not quite meeting my eyes. He absolutely did mean it the way it sounded. But my mother had spent 31 years finding smaller and smaller shapes to fold herself into around my father's moods, and I wasn't going to be the one who asked her to unfold today. Deep in the pocket of my cardigan, my fingers found the cool metal edge of my rank insignia, tucked away where no one could see it. 3 stars, quietly waiting for a moment that hadn't come yet. Dinner that evening stretched across a table groaning under fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Tyler's favorite, obviously. Nobody had asked what mine was in longer than I could remember. Steam rose off the platter in the center of the table, carrying the smell of my childhood straight into my chest. My father sat at the head like always, pouring bourbon like water and telling a story about basic training that had grown 3 inches taller since the last time I'd heard it. "You'd have made this family proud," he said, pointing a drumstick in my direction without breaking stride from his story. "If you'd had an ounce of what your brother has. Instead, you're wasting away in some windowless office." I didn't argue. I never argued anymore. Arguing only fed him more material for later. I took a slow bite of mashed potatoes instead, letting the silence answer for me. Grease glistened on Tyler's fork as he leaned back, chest puffed with the particular pride of a 24-year-old who has just survived the hardest training program his country offers. He had no idea I was the one who'd spent the last 3 days in a secure facility reviewing the exact intelligence package his unit would be operating. "Under next month, you barely know how to lace your own boots without a chief checking them." I thought but didn't say, watching him soak in our father's praise like sunlight. "Robert?" "No. Frank," I corrected myself internally, my mind slipping toward the last man who'd humiliated me on camera, reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Its corners worn soft from decades of handling. He set it down beside my plate with a heavy thud that stopped my fork halfway to my mouth. "Pick it up," he said, his voice dropping low and serious. "Feel what real honor weighs. Something a quitter who bailed on the academy never got the chance to hold." Inside sat his old bronze star, dulled with age, but still catching the light. I lifted it, letting the cold metal rest against my palm, and felt something closer to pity than shame settle in my chest. He had no way of knowing that a locked case at the Pentagon held 6 medals heavier than the one in my hand, tucked away specifically so men like him would never have to reckon with them. A vibration against my hip cut through the moment before I could hand the medal back. My secure phone buzzing in the specific rhythm reserved for the watch floor. "Excuse me." "Work," I said, already standing, chair legs scraping against linoleum. My father snorted into his glass. "Go on then." "Boss, run out of printer paper again?" Tyler laughed around a mouthful of chicken, eyes bright with the same cruelty our father had spent decades teaching him, without ever meaning to call it that. I walked into the hallway and let the kitchen door swing shut behind me. The moment it closed, my posture changed. The tired daughter disappeared, and the officer who had spent 2 decades earning her stripes stepped forward in her place. "Cross here," I said into the phone, voice sharpening into something my family had never once heard. "Ma'am, this is Commander Reyes." The voice on the other end was crisp and thousands of miles away. "Fifth Fleet has eyes on the target vessel. We're green across the board awaiting your authorization. Maintain defensive posture," I said, staring at a photo of Tyler on the hallway wall, all gap-toothed grins and Little League trophies. "If they cross the boundary, you're cleared to engage. Do not let them breach the line." "Understood, Vice Admiral." Moving to intercept. I closed the phone and stood alone in the dark hallway for a long moment, heart pounding not from the order I'd just given, but from the impossible distance between the 2 lives I carried inside one body. When I walked back into the kitchen, my father was mid-laugh at his own joke, and nothing about the room had changed, except for everything I now knew was coming. Morning at Coronado arrived thick with salt spray and jet fuel, the rhythmic thrum of helicopters overhead, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. Today usually felt like home to me. Today it felt like a countdown. My father walked several paces ahead as we approached the security checkpoint, shoulders squared like he was still leading a platoon, instead of clutching a fistful of guest passes for his son's graduation. At the gate, a young petty officer straightened as we approached, eyes flicking between us with the particular alertness of someone new enough to still take the job seriously. "I've got the primary passes right here." "Son," my father said, brandishing his ID like a badge of honor, "this one's just tagging along to help with the gear. Put her wherever the overflow crowd sits." The sailor's eyes moved from my father to me, lingering a half-second too long on my posture, my stillness, something in my bearing that didn't match the label being handed to him. His hand twitched toward my badge like instinct was fighting protocol. I gave him the smallest shake of my head, a silent command only one officer recognizes from another. He swallowed, blinked, and snapped a slightly confused salute in my father's direction instead. "See that?" my father said, chuckling. "Even the kid at the gate knows the difference between a real soldier and someone like you. You're lucky I let you tag along at all. I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the horizon, where the Pacific stretched out flat and endless, and utterly indifferent to everything happening in this parking lot. Inside the graduation hall, rows of dress whites gleamed under industrial lighting, the room humming with a kind of electric pride I understood better than anyone in that building. My parents were ushered to seats near the front, beneath sweeping American flags. My father turned around just long enough to find me standing in the overflow section near the back doors and made a sharp downward motion with his hand. Keep your head down. Don't embarrass Tyler in front of his teammates. I leaned against the cold concrete wall and did exactly that, hands clenched behind my back. The officer inside me holding perfectly still, while something older and more tired screamed for the fairness 2 decades had never once offered her. Then the doors at the side of the stage opened, and every spine in the room snapped straight. General Marcus Hayes, commander of Naval Special Warfare, walked to the podium with the gravity of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to be heard. His gaze swept the room slowly, passing over Tyler in the front row, passing over my father leaning forward eager for recognition, and then stopping cold at the back of the hall on me. A flicker crossed his face, confusion sliding quickly into something sharper. He looked at my plain civilian clothes, at the overflow seating, at the front row where my family sat glowing with borrowed pride, and something in his expression hardened into resolve. He's looking at me, my father whispered giddily to my mother, loud enough for the rows around him to hear. He knows I raised a legend. He was wrong about who the general was looking for, and in about 90 seconds, the entire room would know it too. Silence pressed down over the hall like a physical weight, so complete, you could hear the distant cry of gulls outside the open doors. General Hayes stepped away from the podium without a word of warning. Down the stairs he came, boots striking the polished floor in a rhythm that sounded uncomfortably close to a countdown. He didn't turn toward the VIP section. He didn't turn toward the exits. He walked straight down the center aisle. My father stood as the general approached, hand already extending for a handshake he clearly believed was owed to him. "General Hayes, sir, I'm Frank Cross, Tyler's father." "It's an absolute—" The general moved past him like he was made of smoke. Every head in the auditorium turned in a single motion, tracking the general's path toward the back of the room, toward the overflow seats nobody important was supposed to occupy, toward me. He stopped 3 paces in front of where I stood and snapped his heels together, offering a salute so crisp it seemed to carry the full weight of his career behind it. "Vice Admiral Cross," he said, and his voice didn't need a microphone to reach every corner of that hall. "It is an honor to see you here. I confess I did not expect the architect behind the training pipeline that produced these men to be standing in the overflow section." 200 newly minted SEALs rose in a single violent motion, the crack of their boots against the floor rattling the windows near the ceiling. "Good morning, Vice Admiral," they roared together, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the foundation of the building itself. I watched my father's face drain from red to a ghostly, stunned white. His extended hand dropped uselessly to his side. The old army cap he'd worn like a crown all weekend slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a soft, final thud. "Mr. Cross," General Hayes continued, turning that same ice-cold precision toward my father, "your daughter isn't merely an officer. She personally approved the intelligence assets that kept your son's unit alive through the most dangerous phase of training in the entire program. Without her work 3 weeks ago, I'm not confident your son would be standing here today." The words landed on my father like a physical blow. He staggered back into his seat, hands rising to cover his face as 20 years of quiet contempt finally changed owners. Tyler turned in his seat, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and something closer to grief, the smug confidence of the past week draining out of him in real time. I stepped forward, out of the shadow of the back row, my spine straightening under the weight of an authority I hadn't needed to prove to any of them, but had finally been given permission to show if watching someone finally get the recognition they earned made your chest tighten a little. Drop a like on this one for Elena. And if you've ever carried something heavy in silence, while the people who should have seen you looked right through you instead, type the word "seen" in the comments below. I didn't stay for the reception afterward. The champagne and backslapping and forced small talk could wait. What I needed was salt air that didn't smell like military protocol, and space to breathe that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations of me. Waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm as I walked the edge of Coronado Beach, heels sinking into the cool sand with every step. Each stride felt like effort, the same kind of effort the last 20 years of my life had quietly demanded of me. I should have felt triumphant. I had just been vindicated in the most public way imaginable, in front of 200 witnesses and a 4-star general, and the father who had spent 2 decades convincing himself I was nothing. Instead, salt spray hit my face and all I felt was hollow. My shoulders, finally freed of the lie I'd carried for so long, somehow felt heavier than before, not lighter. I understood then that the 3 stars on my collar had never just represented power. They represented the cost of every bridge I'd had to quietly burn to reach them. Somewhere behind me, footsteps crunched against sand, uneven and hesitant in a way I'd never once associated with my father. He caught up to me near a cluster of driftwood, breathing hard, his usual swagger nowhere to be found. For the first time in my adult life, Frank Cross looked genuinely afraid of something, and that something was me. Elena, he said, my name sounding foreign in his mouth after so many years of hearing it wrapped in disappointment. I don't know what to say to you. You don't have to say anything tonight, I told him, and I meant it. Some conversations need darkness and distance before they can survive daylight. He nodded, and for once, he didn't argue. Evening settled over the rented beach house my parents had booked for the weekend, the kind of quiet that usually invites peace, but tonight felt like a held breath. I sat on the back porch with a glass of sweet tea sweating in my hand, listening to the ocean work at the shoreline. The screen door creaked behind me. That same worn hinge sound I remembered from childhood houses long since sold. My father stepped out carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. He only opened for weddings, funerals, and apparently reckonings. He didn't say anything at first. He just poured 2 glasses and set one down beside me, his hand lingering against mine for the first time in 20 years, instead of pulling quickly away. I spent a long time telling myself you were the disappointment, he began, voice rough and low, barely carrying past the porch railing. I needed you to be one. I built a version of you in my head, just so I'd have somewhere to put all my own failures. Crickets filled the silence he left behind, patient in a way I couldn't quite manage to be. 5 years ago I saw your name, he continued, pulling a crumpled, yellowed newspaper clipping from his shirt pocket. A leaked mention before the censors caught it. National Honors List. Do you know what I did? I tore it up and went to the garage to drink because I was terrified. I turned the clipping over in my fingers, recognizing the ghost of my own redacted name buried in the print. Terrified of what? I asked quietly, though some part of me already knew the answer. Terrified that my daughter had become something better than I ever was, he said, and a tear traced its way down the deep lines of his weathered face. I burned your letters too, every single one, straight into the workshop furnace without opening a single envelope, because I couldn't stand the thought of what success might be written inside. Something in my chest that had been braced for 20 years finally loosened, not into anger, but into something closer to exhausted grief for both of us. I didn't need you to see the Vice Admiral. Dad, I said softly, I just needed you to see your daughter. His head dropped, shoulders shaking with the kind of sob that only comes from a man who has spent decades holding one back. He cried for the years he'd stolen, for the lies he'd handed Tyler, for the father he had failed to become no matter how loudly he'd performed the role. I'm sorry, he choked out. God, Elena, I am so sorry. I stood and pulled him into a hug, and he felt smaller in my arms than I remembered, his frame fragile beneath a shirt that smelled like motor oil and old tobacco. For the first time, that smell didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an apology finally spoken out loud. Sunday morning arrived cold and quiet, sunlight pooling across the kitchen table where my mother flipped pancakes and Tyler clumsily helped with the eggs, still wearing yesterday's exhaustion like a second skin. My father sat at the head of the table with the newspaper spread in front of him, but when I walked in, he did something he hadn't done in longer than I could remember. He stood up and pulled out the chair beside him. Good morning, Elena, he said, and his voice carried none of the old edge. Oh, your coffee's hot, just how you like it. There was no mockery hidden in the words, no barb waiting underneath. For the first time, he was looking at his daughter and seeing exactly that, nothing more performative required. Church that afternoon carried its own kind of reckoning. The same congregation that had whispered about the cross girl who couldn't hack the Navy sat in the same pews, their expressions frozen in decades-old assumptions. My father didn't let that silence stand for long. He walked into the sanctuary with his hand resting firmly on my shoulder, and when the pastor stood to recognize Tyler's graduation, my father rose as well. "We're proud of Tyler today," he said, his voice steady and carrying to the back pews. "But I also want everyone here to know my daughter, Elena, is a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy. She's the real hero in this family, and I have never been prouder to say that out loud." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the congregation, followed by a wave of wide eyes turning in my direction. I didn't shrink from it. For the first time inside those walls, I felt like I actually belonged there. That afternoon I found my father in the living room, surrounded by sawdust, carefully building a display case out of dark, polished oak. He was clearing away decades of Tyler's trophies to make room for something new. With trembling hands, he arranged my dress uniform and officer's sword at the center of the case, pausing to rub a smudge off one of the gold stars on the shoulder board. "I want everyone who walks through that door to know exactly who you are," he said, without looking up. "I spent 20 years hiding your light under a bushel. That ends today." The pain of 2 decades seemed to dissolve a little more in the scent of fresh sawdust, as the warmth finally present in his eyes. Richmond International. Airport buzzed with the ordinary business of goodbyes the next morning. The sky overhead a brilliant cloudless blue. My father pulled me into a hug that felt different from every hug that had come before it. "Go on back to Washington and do your job," he whispered into my ear. "Just know your father's sitting right here waiting to hear from you. We're proud of you, honey." As the plane climbed, I watched the Virginia hills roll out beneath me, the James River winding silver through green fields. I wasn't the family ghost anymore. I was a daughter who had finally been welcomed in from the cold. Weeks later, I stood at a podium inside the historic halls of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, addressing a sea of midshipmen in crisp summer whites. In the front row, seated in the place of honor, sat my father, spine straight, eyes shining with a pride he no longer needed prompting to show. "It is not the critic who counts," I told them, echoing words that have outlived every man who ever spoke them. "It is the person actually in the arena, whose face is marked by dust and sweat and struggle." My father gave a slow, deliberate nod, a single tear tracing the deep lines of his face. I spoke to those young officers about silent battles, the ones fought in windowless rooms and on darkened porches, where nobody is watching, and nothing feels like it will ever be seen. I told them the truth is like a lighthouse, obscured by fog for years sometimes, but never extinguished, patient enough to wait for the fog to finally clear. Then I announced the founding of a new scholarship fund, named for my mother, the woman who had quietly held our family together through every storm my father's pride had ever caused. It exists for the students the world keeps telling they aren't good enough, the ones whose sacrifices happen where nobody is looking to applaud them. My father walked onto that stage beside me, his hand gripping mine with a strength that spoke of total redemption. And together we handed the first award to a brilliant young midshipman from our own home state. Weeks after that, I stood alone on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, deep in the Pacific, watching the sun paint the sky in violent shades of orange and gold. I wasn't a victim of my father's disdain anymore, and I wasn't a ghost haunting my own family's expectations. I was a woman who had architected her own future out of the very silence that once threatened to erase her. I touched the cold weight of the stars on my shoulder and understood finally that the tragedy of being overlooked had become the foundation of my greatest strength as a leader. It had taught me to notice the quiet excellence the rest of the world too often walks right past. Your worth was never a negotiation. Don't let anyone else's inability to see your value become the measure of your own reality. Integrity is a long game, one that doesn't need to shout to eventually be proven true. Thank you for standing with Elena through this story. If it reminded you of your own quiet strength, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like hers. And before you go, tell me honestly, have you ever had to stay silent while you waited for the truth to finally speak for itself? Comment the word steady below. I'll be reading everyone.